Welcome to the Infrastructure Podcast. My name is Anthony Oliver, and today we head back to the vitally important issue of housing, an attempt to understand the UK's complex and some might say largely dysfunctional housing retrofit market. It's a market that is rapidly evolving, driven by ambitious government policies, rising energy costs, and increasing public demand for sustainable, low-cost living. But with a housing stock that's among the oldest in Europe, the UK faces significant headwinds to meet this challenge and achieve net zero carbon emissions by 2050. But my guest today has embraced the challenge wholeheartedly and 2 years ago quit a successful career with global consultancy McKinsey and Co to strike out on her own. Anna formed Hestia, now rebranded as Domna, a brand new business to transform our approach to domestic retrofit and at the same time lever in large amounts of much needed private sector investment. It's a tough market because while the government's commitment to building 1.5 million new homes continues to grab the headlines as the key to driving up living standards and revitalising communities, the need to retrofit our huge existing stock has been left something of an overlooked Cinderella sector. That said, Anna has just secured a £70 million investment into the business, which she hopes will give her access to around £500 billion worth of potential retrofitting work across the UK. So let's find out how she's going to do that. Anna, welcome to the Infrastructure Podcast today.
Thank you so much for having me, Anthony. It is a pleasure.
Well, let's kick off and get straight to your latest big news. I mentioned the big cash injection into your business, Domna Group. The strapline for the business is "We make retrofit easy." So tell us, what is Domna and how do you see it transforming this domestic retrofit market?
Sure. In short, we do energy efficiency for housing portfolios. So you have existing stock, EPC, DEFG, leaky, expensive to run. We take that quite complicated problem and sort it for you. So we start with good, fact-based advice, software-enabled, and then we do the delivery on site to actually whack insulation into walls, put on solar panels, put in a heat pump.
Right. So your clients are they individual families or householders, or are they companies that manage these portfolios?
Individual householders is a market that's for a braver person than me. We serve housing portfolios. So that means housing associations and local authorities, private landlords, big and small. And we serve about 15,000 homes a year today across social and private rental.
Right. Well, the group encompasses consultancy, Osmosis ACD, and the Warm Front team. Why the rebranding, and what does this latest funding enable you to do?
We rebranded because we loved the name Hestia, women in building and in housing, but we were not the only ones. And so we rebranded to Domna as we made the acquisitions. Julia Domna, Empress of Rome, rebuilt the Temple of Vesta. We love powerful women in construction. But our group as a whole, we started as tech startup trying to introduce more use of data and analytics to what's quite a complicated problem. When you ask people, would you want to retrofit your home? People generally say yes. And then about a third drop off because they can't get advice. Another third drop off because they can't find a trusted partner to do it. And about 50% say, sod this, it's too expensive, right? So we started by trying to solve that first problem, give people good fact-based advice with clever modeling. We do that really, really well. We're 97% accurate in predicting post-retrofit outcomes. But we wanted to have impact on the ground and make sure that we weren't just giving people great plans, but also solving these delivery problems. And so we've acquired Osmosis ACD and the Warm Front team, who collectively bring a team of 70 retrofit assessors, coordinators, designers, to make sure that we execute really well.
So they help you actually take that investment proposition and make it work on the ground.
Exactly, and do the doing, right? Because this is a problem of poor information and also poor delivery. And by combining software and services, we solve both.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned Roman Empress Julia Domna. I noticed that that was the inspiration and her focus on building communities. How will you meet your mission to make every home in Britain energy efficient? Because ultimately, you've got to at some point go into people's homes and make changes there, and that is an interface which is fraught with potential bear traps everywhere, I imagine.
Exactly, right? There's absolutely a data and analytics challenge in the sector. But we were very wary of being a software-only company because ultimately the end goal is put insulation into walls, put heat pumps into homes, put solar panels on roofs. And so to us, it was incredibly important that we also deliver the services. And we do that in 15,000 homes a year today.
Yeah. So a typical project for you might be fitting solar panels across a portfolio of properties, or it might be fitting insulation into a portfolio of properties.
Exactly. So as an example proposition for a housing association, through the Warmfront team, we've supported Midland Heart for many years now and completed over 5,000 insulation jobs on their properties. And so we start non-intrusive, we look at their asset list, we navigate the grants for them and figure out where they can get funding, what's it going to cost. We're independent of the installer. That's on purpose so that we give people good independent advice. And then we do the detailed surveys on site and we manage the works. And as I say, for that client, we've delivered over 5,000 insulation jobs over the last several years. That's a typical project for us.
I mean, they are big numbers, but I suppose when you look at, government's got the target of building 1.5 million new homes by 2030, you see the scale of what the UK needs to do. What role do you see retrofitting plays in complementing the government's overall housing goals?
I think we are approaching that 1.5 million number completely the wrong way. We talk about building 1.5 million new homes. We have nearly 1 million long-term vacant properties in the UK. So we've already built 2/3 of what we need, right?
Right.
And it would be cheaper and faster to take possession of those properties or buy them out, retrofit them, and put them into council ownership or private ownership. My concern about approaching the 1.5 million through traditional house builders is that means those units are going to sell for 350, 400,000 pounds per. Somebody who can afford that kind of home is not unhoused today, right? So I think the danger is we whack a whole bunch of money into traditional house building and we don't actually solve our housing shortage. We have nearly 1 million properties that are long-term vacant. We should be taking possession of those, retrofitting them, putting them back on the market.
Which is an interesting point because it brings us to the government's current strategy. Do you think that it adequately balances retrofitting older homes with the development of new housing? Clearly not. I mean, how do you get them to turn around that ship? Because it's difficult. It's very retrofitting is just hard.
Well, yes and no, Anthony. I think we think about it as being, oh gosh, I'm going to have to spend 60 grand per property. It's going to be an absolute nightmare. The lion's share of the work that we do costs less than 10,000 pounds per property. You can do it incrementally, and the tenant most often doesn't have to vacate. And that's because we're working in social housing. We can't afford to force tenants to leave. And so we have to be creative and we have to work incrementally. Nobody ever has enough money. We've never got enough time, And so we really try to be laser focused in which measures are going to have the most impact for the lowest cost and the lowest disruption. It doesn't have to be that we're doing a 40,000 pound plus solid wall insulation job and then another 15,000 pounds on a heat pump. You can start with more incremental measures. And so we end up doing 10,000, 15,000 pound per unit packages. That's something that I think we need to bust as a myth in the market.
And as you say, if we can get access to some of those houses which are currently not lived in or unlivable in, then that would be a very quick win in terms of putting more available housing capacity back into that market.
It would be a heck of a lot cheaper as well than a complete new build. It's less risky. It's faster. Most of the retrofit projects that we work on are 2 to 8 weeks, right? A deep retrofit for a vacant property, it's going to take you more like 3 months, but that's still a lot faster, a lot cheaper, a lot less risky than new build. And it doesn't carry the same embodied carbon. From an emissions perspective, nearly 1/5 of UK emissions come from domestic energy consumption. That's existing leaky houses We have the most poorly insulated housing stock in Europe.
Yeah.
It drives more emissions than aviation, than cement, than steel. This is our biggest and most urgent decarbonization challenge. And it's our most urgent housing challenge. And I just don't think we're going to solve that by building 1.5 million new homes. We need to retrofit the million we've already built.
So that's a philosophical argument. On the ground right now, when you're talking to your housing association clients, your local authority clients, what for them is driving the demand for retrofit right now?
I would say it's a combination of carrot and stick. The stick is they need to pass the decent home standard. We should expect that as an absolute minimum across the rental sector. And that's obviously coming into private rentals as well through the Renters' Rights Bill. We help landlords comply with that and with their obligations to reduce damp and mold, because a retrofit also reduces damp and mold risk if done well. And then the carrot is, we don't talk about this enough, but there's actually about £1 billion a year that gets spent in government grants today on energy efficiency measures for lower income households. The lion's share of that is through the energy company obligation. We work a lot in that program. It's funded by utilities. And so there's a reasonable amount of work that's coming through that today. Obviously, it's never enough. We always need more funding. But I'd say it's a combination of appropriately higher bar for landlords in terms of tenant well-being and the quality of their stock, as well as about £1 billion a year that gets spent in grant funding.
So, and what does the market look like at the moment? You've come in as a startup a couple of years ago. Are there a lot of businesses like you trying to do the same thing, or is it simply, to what extent is it a wild west out there of new startups trying to get in and help?
Nobody's quite like us, Anthony. Of course, I'm going to say that. We see a lot of traditional services businesses. It's very fragmented, right? And then we see a lot of startups that are just doing the software side. So I spoke earlier about how we combine software and services. To my knowledge, we're the only player of our kind doing that. I think that's the model that we need in order to solve this problem. And we expect and hope that others will start to do that as well. But at the minute, we see a lot of traditional services, subscale, variable quality standard. And then we see a lot of startups that are just doing the clever modeling, which is great, but somebody's also got to whack insulation into walls. And to my mind, we need to combine those two.
Yeah. And when you say whacking insulation into walls, whacking the right insulation into walls, because we've heard a lot of stories recently about the wrong kind of insulation being put in for all the right reasons, and we obviously stories post Grenfell, the cladding going on for all the right reasons, but the wrong cladding. How do we make sure that people have got trust in all these things that are being brought to market?
So we have appropriately increased audit requirements, especially for anything that's grant funded. So for any work that we do in social housing and any grant-funded work in private rental, we've got to hit a standard called PAS 2035. And that requires an energy assessor to have a much longer training period, be at a higher technical qualification level, and also produce plans that take into account damp and mold and wider building safety. That's in comparison to much of the private sector where you would have a domestic energy assessor. That training takes less than a week and costs you about 50 quid per bog standard EPC. Doesn't give you good advice about damp and mold. Massively variable quality bar there, and quite poor and changeable advice, right? So to our mind, we need to move towards PAS 2035 across the sector, because it's still very much a Wild West, especially in the privately funded market.
There's also requirement for a lot more consistent government funding to support your private sector investment, because if you're going to leverage £70 million to generate £500 million worth of value, it requires grants, etc. How is the government policy and regulation really impacting the market right now?
We need more stable carrot and stick. And it's not even that we need the government to fund all of this. There does need to be, at the end of the day, a business case for private investors to also make money off of retrofit. And we see that in large parts of the market. We've had debates for years about, is there a green premium? Isn't there? The jury is in on that in housing. We see in the published literature 20% plus valuation improvement from taking the lowest performing EPC F&G rated properties up to a B or a C. We do a lot of our own sampling, and we see on average 67% valuation improvement today on those lowest performing properties. So there's a huge amount of money to be made by investing into this. What we need from the government is two things. One is clarity and consistency on minimum energy efficiency standards. You'll remember in the previous government, there had been a proposal to raise minimum energy efficiency standards to EPCC by 2028. That got dragged out and then ultimately abandoned. We're now in consultation to do that again. We've just got to stick the landing there because people need the clarity about what they've got to hit. And we need the same on the grant side. So we've had a lot of chopping and changing between the energy company obligation funded by utilities versus the social housing decarbonization fund funded directly by government with a co-investment by housing associations. The requirements in those are different. It's a nightmare to navigate between the two. You've got a cottage industry of administration around these things. And every time we've got a program renewal between the third phase of the energy company obligation, for example, and the fourth, that stretched out to 9 months. Dozens of companies went bankrupt during that period, and people left the sector because they said, sod this, I can't make a living doing this. So we need consistency in the grant funding, and we need consistency on EPC minimums.
And I imagine that the other side of that is some big challenges and requirements from the actual delivery side as well, the supply chain that puts this all together. Because I mentioned lack of skills, lack of expertise in this whole market. I mean, does that make for another big challenge in the sector then?
I think a lot of the skills challenge in this bit of the market is actually driven by the haphazard regulation. Because to give you an example, pre-Christmas, much of the government funding was focused around insulation measures and the Great British Insulation Scheme. And so we were going to installers and saying, okay, we need to do a whole bunch of cavity, loft, solid wall insulation jobs with you. They've tooled up for that. They've got their supply chain going. Great. Come January, the government has pumped the brakes on that and is now saying, look, we want it to be solar. So we've got to tool up again. The supply chain needs to tool up again. Right. People need to figure out their procurement. How are they getting the right kinds of solar panels? All of this. And so we need a clear demand signal from government in order for the supply chain to be able to plan for how many people in which trades, what kinds of materials and equipment. Right.
So that all comes down again to, as you say, this consistency of policy. And so where you are on the pipeline of what needs to be done. Are there any particular geographic areas or housing types? I mean, is this an urban landscape thing that you're trying to take on here? Because that's where the majority of houses that are close together are.
For us, we work in housing portfolios, so we always prefer density. And of course, that's a lot easier. Perversely, London tends to be the hardest geography to work in because it's that much more expensive. Every borough has slightly different rules and requirements. Getting parking is a nightmare, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We work quite a bit with the GLA and London councils and really welcome what they're trying to do now in stitching together policy and really driving retrofit across London. So we're really looking forward to seeing some of the outcomes from that. But, the biggest driver of cost and therefore feasibility or not of retrofit is wall type and conservation area. So, to give you an example, on a like-for-like 1960s 90-meter square, 2-bedroom, semi-detached property, if it had a cavity wall, that's about $2,000 to fill the cavity. If it's got a solid wall, it's 40,000 pounds plus in today's market to do solid wall insulation. Right? So that's an enormous cost driver for the same impact and reaching the same EPC. Solar is then a cheaper way for you to try to get solid wall properties up to a higher energy efficiency standard. But if you're in a conservation area or the council doesn't allow it and doesn't approve, you can't do that. And so again, you're forced into a much more expensive type of retrofit. We have 13 million solid wall homes in the UK that are below EPC-C. That's our most pressing problem.
Therefore, I imagine it's about picking the winners in many ways and picking the most appropriate solution for those particular property types. I mean, I live in a Victorian house which has got solid walls, and the majority of the heat loss is out the roof and through the sash windows.
Exactly.
From a personal perspective, I've found that investing in curtains, particularly over the front door, and large jumpers is quite a good way of retrofitting your own home. Anyway, let's talk a bit about you, Anna, and your motivations for doing this, because you launched into the retrofit market 2 years ago in the middle of a successful 10-year career with McKinsey. Were you mad? Why did you do that?
That is very funny. When I told my family that I was leaving my job as a partner with McKinsey to start this business, they said, "You're quitting your job at McKinsey to become a builder?" And absolutely, yes. Look, to me, I spent 10 years with McKinsey. I loved the firm, but I got to partner. I looked around and I thought, surely I should do something with my life that feels a bit more socially and environmentally impactful. I've been very fortunate. I've had a lot of opportunities, and I felt I need to be able to look myself in the mirror and feel that I've used my time and my talents for a hard, important problem. And to me, residential retrofit is our toughest decarbonization and fuel poverty problem. It's a fragmented market. You've got to convince 19 million people to spend money on upgrading their homes, but it's a fifth of CO2 emissions. And I thought, there's no tougher problem. I want to spend time on this.
Well, you're originally from Canada, and you've got a degree and a master's from Yale University in the US. So what led you to building a life and building a business in the UK?
I had a circuitous route when I was with McKinsey. I lived in DC, New York, Nigeria, Ethiopia. I dotted around Morocco, Qatar, UAE, Saudi, went all over with the firm. And a friend created an opportunity to come to the UK by chance. I thought I would spend 6 months here and then move back to the US. And I just fell in love with the UK. And it's been 7 years. So it wasn't that this was the right market, though I think it is. It was more driven by personal circumstance. But to me, this is, we've got the leakiest housing in Europe. This is the most challenging market to try to decarbonize. And we've got very heterogeneous housing stock. So to my mind, if we can make our model work here, then we'll know we've got a model that works everywhere else.
Right, yeah. Well, I first met you when you joined as a trustee of the Built Environment Trust at the Building Centre, where I'm also involved. What attracted you to that particular role at the Building Centre and the Built Environment Trust? Again,
for me, there's a huge element in here about social impact from housing and placemaking. And that role to me is a really important way to have real impact on how people live in their built environment, which shapes all of our lives, right? Both from health and wellness. Do you live in a well-ventilated, properly heated home? Through to your access to education, how easily you can get to work, how much it costs you to get to work, how embedded you feel in your community, how much communication there is within your street and wider community. And so to me, the Built Environment Trust plays a really important role in helping put people at the center of community and placemaking.
Right, yeah. You are super busy, but you always seem to be on a train or a plane or in a taxi whenever I speak to you. What is an average week for you then?
I spend about 3 days a week up with our businesses in the West Midlands and up in Preston. And then the other 2 days a week, I'm either down here in London meeting with institutional investor clients or dotting around meeting with housing associations and local authorities or with some of our contractor and installer partners. to me, there's no substitute for being in person with our clients and being in person with our team. We're a team of 70 now. We're integrating 3 businesses and 3 cultures. And it's really important to me that people feel heard and seen and that they're part of shaping what we're doing and that we're, spending real time with our clients, with our installer and contractor partners, letting them know how much we value those relationships. So I spend all of my time with people.
Well, you probably don't have any spare time, but I'm going to say, what do you do when you're not rushing around the country doing these? What does your downtime look like?
I am a keen, if quite amateur gardener. And so I'm delighted that my spring bulbs have started to emerge, if sadly a little bit earlier and earlier every year. So I spend a fair amount of my time gardening, and I have a lovely, if also quite badly behaved Australian terrier called Hector, who keeps me on my toes. And we do, together with my partner, who's also in real estate, we spend a fair amount of time dotting around countryside with him.
Very good, very good. And do you live in a very nicely retrofitted, warm, energy-efficient home?
I live in a converted Victorian warehouse in Bermondsey, where we have done everything that we can short of what's not allowed by the council.
Oh, right. And was that something you did yourself? Was it an enjoyable, satisfying experience or an absolute nightmare?
Do you know what? I treated it a bit as a test and learn right when we were starting the business of, okay, what does the customer journey look like for the average person? And obviously I know more about the market than the average person, but what does it look like to try to get a PAS 2035 retrofit assessor and understand the difference between that and a DEA? What does it look like to try to get the right contractor and pull quotes? And so I went through that full journey, and I deeply understand the frustrations and the costs that are involved in it. Yeah.
Well, that takes us back to retrofitting, and I suppose the question which is constantly talked about is, can modern technologies accelerate or drive forward our retrofit strategy? How do you see that? Is it about those kind of as old-fashioned techniques, in many ways old-fashioned, of just simply putting insulation in and draft prevention, or is it about solar panels, heat pumps, smart home integration?
So the answer is both. But by and large, the technologies exist, and this is a problem about delivery, right? So about 55% of energy efficiency improvement in homes is likely to come from energy efficiency, insulation, LEDs, smart thermostats that help you reduce the amount of energy that the home is consuming.
Yeah.
And then the balancing, call it 45%, needs to come from decarbonizing energy sources, right? Putting on solar panels, putting in heat pumps, or decarbonizing the grid. And there's a lot of debate about, well, how much time do we need to spend on fabric versus do we just let the grid decarbonize? I don't think we can afford to wait. And so to that end, we need to do what we can at the individual home level, which means insulation and solar panels and or heat pumps. If we decarbonize the grid, great. But that's a multi-year proposition. It's going to cost a whole lot more than decarbonizing individual homes. But, we've invented insulation, we've invented solar panels. Of course, we're always improving these things, but this is about innovation in delivery, not innovation in technology.
Right. But of course, that innovation is hugely helped by the use of data and energy modelling that you've brought to play, because that helps you design and deliver, I suppose, the retrofit projects that work, and you can demonstrate that they're working.
Exactly, and it helps you show what the right package of measures is and also what the business case is. When we work in social housing, there's grant funding available and a recognized social obligation to improve the properties. That's about 2 million of the 19 million homes that we need to retrofit in the UK. For the other 17 million, people need to see a financial return, right? And so when we do our modeling outside in, we've combined 11 different data sets with 4 billion data points to give us 97% accuracy outside in and predicting what the right package of measures is, but also to give us accuracy in estimating what's going to be the valuation improvement on that property, what's going to be the reduction in bills that either goes to overall tenant affordability or goes to rental yield improvement, what's going to be the improvement in duration of tenancy because tenants are happier and stay in a property longer. We need to be able to also give that financial case.
And I suppose that also drives you towards being able to demonstrate the social impact that you're creating, because I imagine that as a business, Domna, you've got to ensure that your projects contribute to the broader social outcomes, reducing fuel poverty, improving health and well-being, etc. That's key to you, is it?
Exactly. There's 6.5 million homes in the UK in fuel poverty. Choosing between food and fuel in a very real way, that needs to be our priority first and foremost. The lion's share of the work that we do is in social housing, addressing those communities directly. There's also, as you say, an enormous health impact. Some great research done by Becky Taylor and her team at AREP that saw 2.1 times multiplier on retrofit investment. The lion's share of that came out of reduced healthcare costs.
Right, yeah. And that in many ways comes down to government looking at this issue as a cross-departmental win rather than just a siloed win in the property sector, etc. We've talked about some policy change or additional government support that you see being required, and it's clearly there's some hard work needed to be done there. But also, are there some really big opportunities for these public-private partnerships that could scale up the retrofitting efforts across the UK?
I think the single biggest one would be the government supporting a UK-wide compulsory purchase scheme for the nearly 1 million vacant properties, putting those then back into a combination of council-owned and privately owned hands, and letting private investors invest into those, right? Because that would let us put 1 million homes back into circulation and meet our housing deficit.
And that is a way you think that policymakers could actually make a transformational step in accelerating our delivery of homes, but also our delivery of lower carbon lives.
Exactly. So the other for me is temporary accommodation. We spend an enormous amount of money on that today, and there are some really interesting public-private partnership models. Pick, for example, investing into Bromley in a long-term JV to acquire stock, invest into it, and then return it to council ownership to alleviate the need for temporary accommodation. That's a proven model that works really well that we'd love to see more councils doing.
Really big interventions there with potentially really big returns for society. But they're hard, Anna. Any regrets about your decision 2 years ago so far?
No, without sounding sanctimonious, I think you need to be able to look at yourself in the mirror and feel that you've used your time for something impactful. And I felt I was in a fortunate enough position to be able to take this risk, and that I wanted to be able to feel like I had really made a difference and thrown myself into a difficult problem. And it is my enormous privilege to be working with a fantastic team of people who share that vision and mission, and fantastic partners and the Housing Association, local authority, private investor, contractor, installer side, who work with us quite collaboratively to do that and share that mission and drive. So it's a challenging issue, but there are a lot of people across the UK, incredibly driven, incredibly talented, who are dedicating their lives to making this work. And I feel quite confident and optimistic about what we can all do together.
Well, it's a fascinating and a really important issue, and thanks so much thanks for your passion behind it, but also thanks for sharing it with us today and taking time out to join us today on the Infrastructure Podcast. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Anthony.
It's a pleasure. But that's all we've got time for today on the podcast. But there is more in the pipeline and more to talk about as we continue to probe the big issues faced across the sector. If you haven't done so already, do check out the Infrastructure Podcast website, www.infrastructure-podcast.com, where you will find background information and all the latest podcasts to listen to and to share. So thanks for joining us, and thanks again to Anna. And I look forward to seeing you all again very soon.